I told the deacon before Mass, if my homily makes any kind of sense, it's purely the Holy Spirit, because this is the stuff that they write doctoral theses on. Quick history of Israel. The nation of Israel, a couple generations after King David fell apart, and the northern tribes and the southern tribes split. Southern tribe was called Judah, and the headquarters of it was Jerusalem. It was the pearl of the whole country. The people of the nation of Israel quit following God. They thought, we got this made. And they started intermarrying with people who worship pagan gods and did all kinds of strange things and thought that they had it under control. We're Israel. No one messes with us. Well, they got scared because the nations around them started coming against them, and because they divided, they weren't as strong as they once were. And because they quit relying on God, they were certainly less strong than they were before. The Assyrians came in. The Assyrian nation came in and just crushed the northern kingdom, and they tried to crush the southern kingdom, but they stopped at the walls of Jerusalem because it was too strong. And that's about the time that the prophet Isaiah came into the picture. He was preaching and telling them in the nation of Judah and in Israel, rely on God. Don't rely on your neighbors, because they were making pacts with other countries that did not have their best interest at heart. It would be kind of like if the United States had a Great Depression, God forbid, and the rest of the world was doing okay, and we would pay tribute to Russia to protect us against China. You'd always have to watch your back. The idea is that's what they were doing. They were relying on alliances with Egypt and other countries. And the prophet's saying, rely on God. Open your eyes and see what he has in store for you. And he talks about what it would be like if they relied on God. The tyrant will be no more, and the arrogant will have gone. All who are alert to do evil will be cut off. Those whose mere word condemns a man, who ensnare his defender at the gate. So in other words, his lawyer comes in to try and defend him, and they snatch him so that he has no defense. Those injustices will all be done away with if they just revere God. Now Jacob will have nothing to be ashamed of, nor shall his face grow pale when his children see the work of my hands in his midst. The people won't be embarrassed to say, I rely on God. I'm not relying on Egypt. I'm not relying on some other false god. I rely on God himself. Speak up for what's right. Look at our nation now. People are almost embarrassed to make the sign of cross in public. Oh, you're a Catholic? They're afraid to speak up for what's right. We celebrate today the feast of St. John of Damascus, who was a monk who lived in the desert not too far from Bethlehem. And he always stood up for what was right. He was one of the great fathers of the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church. And one of the things that he did was he stood up when the Christian emperor said, you're not going to have any more pictures. It was called the iconoclast era, where they tried to get rid of all the icons. They say, you're worshiping pictures, you're worshiping statues. And they would take Christ off the cross and just leave the cross there. But we're a people that have to have tangible evidence. How often do our minds wander in prayer? That's why we have images of Christ to make us center and make us focus. See, he knew that it was right. That they didn't just have some artist paint these pictures. They pray for months as they're painting the pictures of the icons. But he spoke out for the truth, but he did it in love. Normally, they would have run him out of town on the rails, but God protected him. He was in a monastery right away from Israel. But the monastery was in a land that was taken over by the Muslims. So basically, they couldn't get at him. He was protected by the people that they normally would have thought were their enemies. God has a way of protecting us, of taking care of us, even in the midst of all kinds of tragedies. It's so easy for us now to hunker down and be afraid. It's so easy for us to count on medical um, devices and hand sanitizer and that. And we need to do the things that make sense. But we also need to trust in God that He has a plan. And through this whole process, He'll bring us together if we continue to rely on Him. If we don't rely on Him and we just hunker down and argue with one another instead of praying with one another, we'll become weaker and weaker like Israel, not only as a nation, but as a family. It's so important that God has given us now the time to pray together as families, to eat together as families, to turn things around that have been going downhill for a whole generation. But it's up to us to open our eyes like the blind men that were cured in the gospel. Because they had faith, Jesus could open their eyes. It's time for us to open our eyes to what's going on around us in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our nation, and our church. To gently stand up for what's right, to teach the truth in love, and to pray like we've never prayed before.